All right, good day, everyone. This is CJ, and welcome to another edition of Hanging with Harley Schlanger of LaRouche PAC and also the Schiller Institute. Harley, it's a new year. We've had one podcast, and it's good to catch back up with you. How are you today, sir?
Doing very well. The world situation is quite exciting overall.
These are very exciting times, geopolitically here in the U.S. We're still looking at this lockdown that's occurring. It's just amazing today, Harley, how the media has become so weaponized in terms of the counter narratives, in terms of the opposition partnering with the Democrats. What's on your radar, Harley?
Well, we've done a fairly lengthy new report on where a lot of these operations in the United States come from. And of course, we've been discussing this for a while. Much of this comes straight out of the City of London and the British oligarchy. But this latest self-expose of this Integrity International, or Integrity Initiative rather, which is a British Foreign Ministry operation that's engaging in psychological warfare, or PSYOPs, around the world to target anyone who says anything nice about Putin or Russia, as well as anyone like Trump who says we should work with Putin. Or, for example, a handful of German political figures who say, look, Russia and Germany have some common interests. If you say that, you're immediately labeled a Putin puppet. And it goes out through these networks of journalists. They call them clusters. This is what the Integrity Initiative does. It smears and slanders anyone who has the policy of President Trump, which is we shouldn't be at war with Russia. We should be talking with them. We should be working with them. So when you know that, then you take a look at some of the events going on. For example, since the last time I was on with the Hanging with Harley, there have been about 4 examples of stories that came out attacking Trump on one story or another about Russiagate, all of which were discredited very quickly, the latest being the BuzzFeed story. Now, why is this going on? Well, look what's happening in England. The Brexit policy has collapsed. May's government is in terrible shape, and they can't find anyone in the Tories who would take her place, and they're terrified that if they had an election, Corbyn and Labour would win. Look in France, where the yellow vests continue their mobilization. Macron is a laughingstock. In Germany, where there's really no government that's doing much of anything except holding its place. Then you look at Italy, where the Italian government is working closely with China, working with African countries, and also Di Maio, the head of the Five Star Movement, just came out last week and said Italy's going to go with Glass-Steagall, not an European Union bailout policy. So there are fascinating developments, all of which are going against the City of London. Now, you look at the question of the United States, everyone's focused on the shutdown, on the building the wall. But while all this is going on, Trump is developing a working relationship with the president of Mexico. This hasn't happened for quite a while, where an American president and a Mexican president are working together in a fairly coherent way. Their strategy is, and López Obrador agrees with Trump on several important points, that there should be no free trade along the lines of NAFTA, that immigration from Mexico is a problem. And López Obrador said his dream is that no one from Mexico should ever have to go to the United States to find a job. And Trump then came up with over $11 billion in development aid for Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras on the one side, half of it, and the other half goes to Mexico for infrastructure development and for border security. So there are things going on that Americans don't know about because the media in the United States is controlled by these clusters of British agents who are out to get a war between the United States and Russia. That's their goal. If they can't control the Chinese and the Russians, they're prepared to go to war. Now, one bit of evidence on this is Seymour Hersh has just written an extraordinary article called The Vice President's Men about how George Herbert Walker Bush was running wet works, assassination operations, when he was vice president under Reagan. It's an extraordinary article, very well documented, and no one in the U.S. will print it. I think it's the London Observer or the London Review of Books or some British publication ran it, but they won't run it in the United States or in any of the major publications in Britain, because it goes right after this Atlantic Alliance, the Bush network, the neoconservatives, and their links with the neoliberals and the British. So if people want to see the report we have, you can go to LaRouchePAC.com and just type in Barbara Boyd Integrity Initiative. And it's a 3-part report which includes the way the British have been involved at the center of Russiagate.
Wow, that's very interesting, Harley. V, also want to welcome you to the broadcast. V, we're on with Harley. V, or can you hear me okay? Okay, I'll go ahead and continue, but I did see him join. Harley, and again, very interesting facts that, again, you will not see reported here in the U.S. media. They would rather fixate upon the fake news and just a vicious cycle. The BuzzFeed was, that was one that was completely fabricated. This narrative has to end. Now, there's some upcoming meetings that are planned in China, I believe, soon. Harley, what can you update us in terms of the trade negotiations we're talking about? We've heard in the news about some $1 trillion in terms of China saying they're willing to do some imports with the United States. Any update in regards to the trade discussions?
Well, there are a couple things coming up. I mean, one is that later in the spring, you're going to have the follow-up to the extraordinarily successful Belt and Road Initiative conference from a year ago, where Xi Jinping went through the Chinese goals for 2025 and 2050. And these include complete elimination of poverty in China by 2020, and then spreading that through the Belt and Road program to South Asia by 2030. So China has already proven they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty in the last 2 decades. Their plan is working. Now, in the meantime, the negotiations between the U.S. and China have progressed generally pretty well on trade. There are 2 problem areas. One is the panic coming out of Silicon Valley of having to compete with Chinese artificial intelligence and Chinese cell phone technology, Huawei, for example. And what the attack, the jailing of the CFO of the company in Canada, the fact that the Defense Department is saying that they want to make sure none of those cell phones are available in the United States. There's a real reaction against China from certain segments of U.S. industry that, quite frankly, 20 years ago were way ahead of China, but the Chinese have caught up and in some ways have gone ahead. China is a totally mobile society that way. Now, secondly, you have some of the military people who are saying you've got to be prepared for war with China. And they're talking about challenging China in the Straits of Taiwan and also in the South China Sea. Now, Trump's policy is, let's get a deal. Let's work on this with trade. China needs us. We need them. And of course, we saw the results of the China-U.S. cooperation with the meeting that took place last week with the envoy from Kim Jong-un from North Korea, who met with Pompeo and then met with Trump. And there's another meeting now scheduled sometime in February between the North Koreans and the U.S., where it looks as though we will get some kind of a timetable on the denuclearization. So Trump is working very hard to make this situation with China work. The Chinese, of course, don't want trade war. They get too much benefit out of trading with the United States, but then so do we. The question that behind this, though, CJ, the real important question is, can there be a revitalization of manufacturing in the United States? And while the president has correctly pointed out that there have been an increase in manufacturing jobs in the 2 years he's been president, it no way has come close to replacing the 6 to 8 million manufacturing jobs we've lost in the United States since 2001. And you're not going to get a revival of manufacturing in the United States by using punitive tariffs against China. However, you can get manufacturing jobs in the United States if you go to a Hamiltonian credit policy and make credit available to manufacturers, to small and medium enterprises, as opposed to just pouring funny money into the hands of speculators. And I think President Trump is somewhat caught on the horns of a dilemma here, because on the one hand, he's touting the stock market going back up as a sign of a strong economy, and then saying, therefore, we need the cheap money. But the cheap money is largely restricted to speculators, to the too big to fail bankers, and it's not getting into the hands of producers. And so I think at some point we're going to see a reset coming from the White House. It could include Glass-Steagall. You know, the president's very keen on what's happening in Italy, and the Italians are very serious about breaking from the European Union and going with Glass-Steagall as an attack on the European Central Bank model of financing. Now, one other thing from Europe. In Austria, it's very possible that after the European elections, and these are elections all across Europe for the European Parliament, if the so-called nationalist or national sovereignty groups win as expected, the Austrians may then take the next step and say they want a referendum similar to the Brexit referendum. So I think we're seeing a lot of things moving, and the China thing is one of them. And I think the president is committed. The Chinese are committed. It's still a question of satisfying certain specific requirements. I think the intellectual property requirement is pretty much resolved. What may not be resolved yet is how many billions of dollars of goods the Chinese will let in. And there's still some hardliners in the Trump administration saying that China should open up its banking system to the West. And the Chinese are just not going to do that for good reason.
Hey, how are you? It's V.
Hey, V, how you doing?
I'm doing good, my friend. I'm hanging in there. I apologize for the lateness. I was just finishing up a conference call on my end, and I was just listening into you and CJ talk. Harley, there's a lot of things going on. We have the maniacal mustache John Bolton flying around the world, and you see some of the aggression that's being spewed out there, like you mentioned before, with the Strait of Taiwan or the Formosa Strait, and also the South China Sea. Now, there's also some things that are happening in Yemen. We've seen recently that the Russians have started communicating with the Houthi rebels, something that's, engaging them actively, trying to bring an end to the conflict in Yemen. And we also know China's longstanding ties to Yemen going back to 1954. What's your opinion on what's happening there, especially as the sun sets, and I'm hoping to God the sun's setting on the murderous, schizophrenic U.S. foreign policy?
Well, that's the real question, because the only way the Saudis would continue to carry out a genocidal policy against Yemen, using the argument that the Houthis are Iranian proxies, which is simply not true. The only way that works is if the U.S. backs the Saudis. And we're seeing motion from both parties, nervous about continuing that, especially after the Khashoggi murder. But we're also seeing a real differentiated policy coming because of the Russians. You know, the Russians have the upper hand in the Middle East, and they don't want war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Maybe John Bolton does. Maybe Netanyahu does. And Netanyahu certainly is doing everything he can to encourage that, because his ass is in a sling also. He faces getting run out of government for corruption. You know, the idea that they're suddenly discovering that Bibi Netanyahu is corrupt is kind of funny to me. Sort of like discovering that the FBI is a terrible organization and untrustworthy. People should have known it for a long time. But, the Netanyahu government's in big trouble politically, and what are they doing? They're trying to ramp up the war with the argument for war against Iran using Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iranian troops in Syria. I think Putin is trying to work something out on that, and the more he talks with Trump and the more he talks with Erdogan, the more likely we are to see an end of the British Empire control over the U.S. And a very significant report, I didn't mention this earlier, but it's in our dossier that we've done on Integrity Initiative and the whole British operation. The House of Lords put out a report 2 weeks ago lamenting Trump's break with the special relationship with Britain, and saying, look, we can probably survive one term of Trump. That is the British special relationship by which they think British brains and American brawn can rule the world. But they go on to say that they don't think it will last if Trump is reelected. And that tells you everything you need to know about the Christopher Steele dossier, the role of Sir Richard Dearlove and MI6 in running operations together with Brennan, Clapper, Comey, McCabe, the whole cabal of the Justice Department and the FBI. It's a fear that the special relationship, which was forged largely through Churchill's domination of Harry Truman, that this is about to be broken by Trump.
Right.
Trump doesn't give a damn for the Queen. He made it clear he doesn't think curtsying to the Queen is an proper American response.
Exactly correct.
Obama curtsied to the Queen. The Bushes curtsied to the Queen. As far as I know, Bill Clinton did. Hillary certainly did. Trump is different. If you break the special relationship, you can solve the problems with Saudi Arabia and Israel, because the Netanyahu regime and the Wahhabite regime in Saudi Arabia depend on backup from the City of London and from Washington.
Right.
If that changes, those two countries are going to have to recognize the new reality, which is that the Russians are the new sheriff in town.
Yes. Right. Exactly.
And the
exactly
petrodollar itself is not sacrosanct.
No, it's not. It's pretty much over. I mean, OPEC is gone the way of every other archaic system that has existed and cartel that has existed before. It's gone to the dustbin of history. It's literally fallen apart. They're acting less like a cartel and more like every man for himself. Harley, the yellow vest. I don't know if you got a chance to speak on this before I came on, but the yellow vests are getting greater and greater momentum in France. Macron is in quite a pickle, so to speak. What is you have Salvini in Italy making demands as well. So the EU is at a very, very fragile state that it's in. Well, how do you see this playing off, considering the other global geostrategic events that are happening as well?
I think CJ and I discussed this right at the very beginning of the program. This is it's a really promising situation because May can't hold on. If they try to do a wingding of a second referendum, that will probably bring out a very large number of yellow vests in the United Kingdom. The fact that May failed, that May's policy is Brexit, which is not Brexit, doesn't satisfy the pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit side. So the United Kingdom is really in serious trouble. The banking system there is trying to figure out how to move to Frankfurt and to Brussels to continue their role in the clearinghouses for the derivatives trades, and they're not going to be able to do it. But the derivatives trading operation itself is heading toward the dustbin of history.
Right.
It doesn't serve any purpose except to make speculators filthy rich. And what we're seeing, you mentioned the Salvini and Geraci and Conte, the prime minister of Italy, all saying we're not going to continue with the EU banking system. The EU, in fact, there's a bank in Genoa that's basically going under because of the EU policy. And the Italians were told they're not allowed to bail it out. The government, the national government's not allowed to. It has to go through the bail-in, namely stealing depositors' money. And the Italian government basically said to the EU, you will not dictate to us how we handle sovereign assets of the Italian people.
Correct.
So they're going to do something to keep the bank running, but they're not going to reward the speculators. And that's why they're talking now about Glass-Steagall for Italy. I think in terms of France, the Yellow Vests just had their 10th Saturday, or maybe it was the 11th Saturday demonstrations last weekend. They were quite large. In some cases, the police are taking Macron's leadership and beating people up. In other cases, the police are not. You actually are moving toward what you might call a dual power situation, or where a mass strike starts dictating the policy, because Macron is out of bullets. He has no solutions. His solutions are more power to the European Union and the European Central Bank, and they no longer can sell that in France. They can still sell it in Germany to some extent, because the Germans have completely drunk the Kool-Aid that the only solution is to stick with the euro and the European Central Bank. But I think that's going to change too. I've done some meetings. I was in Hamburg, I was in Frankfurt, and people who previously were gung-ho on the euro are now saying, tell us what the options are. So I think a lot of this comes back to what happens in the United States. Right. If the president breaks with this idea that the solution for the U.S. economy is 0% interest with the funny money going to the speculators to get a stock market bubble, if he breaks with that policy, he has nowhere to go except against the Fed and for a national credit or a Hamiltonian credit policy, especially if he wants to revive manufacturing. So I think we're on the up and up. The danger is that a desperate rabid dog is not a funny thing to play with. You've got to put it down. And that's what has to happen to this imperial, neoliberal, neoconservative gang.
Absolutely. I mean, and we're seeing some of the deep state having its death rattles. It's like a death rattle of a dying jackal. We've seen it with Netanyahu lobbing missiles over into Damascus. We've seen it with the supposed Taliban setting off a bomb in Afghanistan, all within days and weeks of Trump announcing a withdrawal of U.S. troops from both hotspots.
And don't forget the reaction of the cowards in the U.S. Congress to an ISIS attack on American soldiers in Syria, saying that this is because we're pulling out and it's going to get worse and we have to stay in. In fact, ISIS did that precisely because they want the U.S. to stay. Correct. Having U.S. troops in Syria is a recruiting poster for ISIS.
Yep. And Harley, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see it or not, but the new, fully disclosed American leadership of ISIS, led by U.S. citizens, which are basically CIA patsies, Harley. Did you see that?
Yeah. Unreal. Well, it's the only thing that's causing it is that they can't find enough Arab Muslims anymore who want to be in front of ISIS.
Exactly.
So the cover has been ripped off. You know, I mentioned earlier the other thing. You talk about a breakdown of the sense of moral authority. People should get a hold of the new Seymour Hersh article on George H.W. Bush. What a murderous bastard that guy was.
Oh, my God, yeah.
Behind Reagan's back. And Hersh quotes from people who were close to Reagan who said that the Bush crowd thought Reagan was a moron and an imbecile and they could do whatever they wanted. The fact that this is coming out right now, when you have an attempt to use the passing of George H.W. as a way to revitalize the Bush dynasty, you know, it's not going to work, especially as long as there are people like Hersh around who know the real story.
Yep, exactly right. No, I missed that article by Hersh. You know, and Poppy Bush, and they called him Poppy because of his involvement in narco trafficking. Mena, Arkansas, and at that time a very young Governor Bill Clinton. But that's another story for another day, Harley.
But the reason you missed that story is the U.S. media won't run it. That's
right.
The whole operation of this British Integrity Initiative, to keep these kinds of stories out of the press and to say that Sy Hersh is nothing but a Russian leaker. The Yellow Vests are nothing but a Russian deployment against the wonderful European Union, and so on. And it wears thin at a certain point, doesn't it? A few more BuzzFeed articles, and I think maybe even Mueller's going to have to come out and just say, look, stop the nonsense. I've got the real story, and we'll see what he has, but I don't think he has much.
No, he really doesn't. And did you see the CNN's Brian Stelter, the ultimate beta male soy boy, begging the audience to please trust us when this whole entire BuzzFeed thing has completely blown up in their face, Harley? It was hilarious to see it.
Well, Glenn Greenwald did a piece called The 10 Most Outrageous Stories About Russiagate. And among them, of course, are the one that Luke Harding, who's a leak sheet for MI6, said that Manafort went into the Ecuadorian embassy and met with Assange on several occasions. That's been blown out of the water. The one that was associated with Louise Mensch, who's a completely insane, drug-addicted
She's a nut.
Parliamentarian, who claimed that Czech intelligence passed on to her that Michael Cohen's cell phone pinged. They caught a couple pings from his cell phone in Prague to prove that Christopher Steele was right. And now everyone's distanced themselves from that story. It's amazing because you can lie forever. You can tell lies forever. But at a certain point, if there's no confirmation of the lies, people begin to see that it's not just that there were a bunch of lies, but the whole process was a fraud.
Correct.
And I think we're heading toward that. That's why we wrote this new dossier on the British control of the whole Russiagate. And again, it's available on LaRouchePAC.com. The author is my colleague, Barbara Boyd, and I highly recommend it. I know your audience does read, does think about things. Go to LaRouchePAC.com and get this dossier and study it. And it will probably, for those who don't already understand the British question, at least it will raise the right questions.
Very well said. Harley Schlanger, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this vital information with us and keeping us abreast on the latest victories for the masses, Harley. And I like hearing that. Some good news as always. With that being said, folks, thank you all for listening in. And CJ, take it away.